Shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. This is my 1986 Pontiac Trans Am. For any of you guys who may have forgotten that I own it, because it's been so long since I made a video. However, in these upcoming weeks, months, I am not going to stop until this thing is running and out of here. So grab a snack, take a seat, and let's build the fuel system. So I pretty much have everything I'm going to need, at least I hope I do, laid out behind me to get the fuel system in the Trans Am. Now, if you're new here, I am in the middle of putting a Gen 5 LT motor into this thing. Now, I say LT because it's an LED 3. It's actually the truck version of those motors. It's a 5.3. It came out of a 2016 Yukon. Pretty much the same as like a 5.3 or a 6.0 LS motor. It's technically not an LS because it's a Vortec truck motor, but it's in the same family. So you do still technically call it an LS swap because it's tomato, tomato, everything swaps over between the motors. Now I am building this thing with the future in mind, so I do plan on boosting this car eventually. So I am going with a larger fuel line, a larger feed line. I'm going with a boost reference fuel pressure regulator, and I'm going with a larger intake pump. Now I know eventually if I get to the point or my goal for power with this thing, I am gonna have to add a second pump in there. And you guys know in, I don't think it's the previous video, a couple of videos back, when I did the wiring for the engine, I did wire 2 fuel pump relays back there, and I have the wiring back there for 2 fuel pumps. So that's kind of already future-proofed. But in today's video, we are just gonna be installing one because I'm not gonna really need 2 fuel pumps in there. Why have one that's not gonna be used as sitting in there soaking gas for no reason? And yeah, we're gonna get this whole entire thing built. I'm gonna show you how to get the fuel sender assembly modified to accept a electric fuel pump, or a larger electric fuel pump. The car right now has no fuel pump in the tank because it is carbureted, or it was carbureted. So we're gonna pull that out, modify it, add a pump, put some fresh lines from the back up to a new regulator, then make that connection from the regulator to the engine. So before we get started here, I'm just gonna give you guys a quick little crude drawing of what I have planned. So just please bear with me because these drawings, they're just gonna be labeled boxes. Really, I have absolutely no artistic ability, but here's gonna be our feed coming off the tank. This is gonna be the output of the fuel pump. Let's just say down here is gonna be our return. This is gonna be the fuel coming from the engine back to the tank. So obviously in the tank, we're going to add an electric fuel pump. That's not a turd, that is an electric fuel pump. And then from there, I'm just gonna run this line straight up to our fuel pressure regulator. So the regulator I got, it actually has an inlet, an outlet, and then a return port. So what's gonna happen is the fuel's gonna come in this side, it's gonna come out this side, go to our rail. Those are injectors, by the way. And then any residual fuel that, whatever the regulator is set at, that's gonna come down through this port and go back to the tank. Now along this feed line, I am gonna put a filter. So right here, that's gonna be a filter, also not a turd. And this is pretty much what I'm gonna end up with. Now, because I'm using the factory truck style fuel rail, this only has 1 port. Now, ideally, the way these are set up from the factory, these LT motors when they're in the Yukons and whatever, the fuel pump itself is pulse width modulated, so the computer will actually speed up or slow down the pump, and that's gonna regulate fuel pressure. I'm not hooking that up. I'm just gonna be running a regular fuel pump. It's gonna have a regular relay on, off, and then this is gonna do my regulating. Now, for these motors, I believe PSI conversion told me about 70 or 75 PSI. I have to confirm that, is where we're gonna wanna set the regulator at. So if you are doing a Gen 5 swap like me, these motors do take a little more fuel pressure, whereas the regular LS stuff takes about 58. Now it is worth mentioning, ideally you would want the regulator on the return side of the fuel system, but because of the way the factory fuel rail is set up, and I am just using that with 1 port, it's kind of not possible. So let's say you have some aftermarket fuel rails. What you would do, kind of like how I have on my Camaro, I have radium rails. It's gonna come out of the filter. We're gonna have 2 fuel rails right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are our injectors. The feed is going to come from the tank. We're gonna split it at a Y. So the fuel is gonna go to each fuel rail, and then from there, it's gonna come out of here and then go into, if I could do this correctly, because I cannot draw. So it's basically going to go into both sides of the regulator like that. And then from there, actually I have this backwards. Let's say this is the return port. From there, it'll go back to the tank. So the fuel is coming in, it's getting split off evenly. Injectors are getting what they need. It's going to go into both sides of the regulator, and then whatever excess pressure is going to be returned to the tank. So this is going to be ideal if you have aftermarket rails, but for me, we're going to be doing the first way. Now, if you have, or if you're in the middle of doing a regular LS swap, it's going to be a lot simpler. So right here, once again, we have our tank. Probably don't need to label it, but what the hell? We have our feed, and then we have our return. Once again, we'll have an electric turd pump in there. So from here, all we're going to want to do is run a Corvette fuel filter. So I'm going to put a link to this down below. But basically the Corvette fuel filter for the LS swaps, it has the regulator built into it. So once the fuel gets to the filter, it's automatically going to regulate it to 58 PSI. So that's going to come out of the filter. It's going to go to our rail. That's going to have 58 PSI right there. And then for the return, the Corvette filter actually has a return line on it. So all we're going to do is make our return right from the filter, connect it back to the tank, and that's it. That's your fuel system for your LS swap. Now, if you have dual fuel rails, you would just, I don't really need to erase the rail there, but you would just split this off. So run it to a T, and then those ends could be plugged, and then that'll be it. You'll have 58 PSI coming right out of here, going to each rail, and you're done. It'll get returned right at the filter. So here is pretty much the Trans Am's entire fuel system. Now, depending on your year, how your car was equipped, there's gonna be some differences, like where the fuel lines are gonna end up, either on the passenger side or the driver's side, and whether or not you're gonna have a fuel pump in the tank, because if your car's carbureted, you're just gonna have a stick in there with a sock. If it's fuel injected, obviously, you're gonna have a pump in there. So let me bring you guys in close, kind of give you the rundown what's going on, what I'm gonna end up with, and then we'll get to modifying the sender. So right away, being my car was carbureted, the small block fuel pump is mounted on the passenger front of the engine. So the fuel lines ended up right here. That's where they were routed from the factory. You see they hop over the transmission tunnel, then they go back to the tank. On my Camaro, that was a V6 fuel injected car. The lines ended up over here. So this line here is the evap. This went to the evap canister that was mounted in the driver's side battery tray. That's going away. I'm not running evap. And you do want to make sure when you pull this stuff out, if you are replacing your lines, the rear brake line is kind of wound up in this. It's clamped at the bottom. So just make sure you separate that before you go ripping these out. Otherwise, you're going to be replacing your brake line as well. But regardless of your engine configuration, if your fuel lines are on the passenger side or the driver's side, they're all going to come back this way. They're going to loop around the rear seat well, and then they're going to have these rubber connections where they branch over to the tank. Now, if you look here, we're going to have these 4 lines. So we have our feed, our return, our vent, and our evap. So the first 3 are going to go up to the front of the car, the feed, the return, and the evap. The last one is just a vent right down here. So this is going to go from this little valve up into the center. And all that is a one-way valve that it lets air in, but not out. And that's just so when the fuel's being used up, air needs to come in there. Otherwise, the tank's going to like collapse on itself. So that's what that valve does. Now, because my car is carbureted, we do not have an electric pump in there. And I do have a new fuel sender assembly that we're going to be modifying to work with my new fuel system. And it's going to allow us to mount the pump. And plus, you know, this thing's 30 years old. Makes sense to put a nice new sender in there. But jumping over to the car, yes, I do have a fuel pump access door. And unfortunately, you cannot remove this sender assembly without removing the gas tank. Just the way the hard lines run, they go over this way, they go over that way, and they bend down. It's physically impossible to get the thing out without pulling the tank out. Now, the way I'm building my fuel system, my lines aren't going to run down that way anymore. I'm going to have them come straight out, so that's why I cut this out. And my tank has already been drained. So if you're doing anything like this, making fuel pump doors, cutting lines, I use an oscillating saw to cut everything. So that's why I had absolutely no sparks. And even though everything was emptied, my tank was bone dry, there was still some fuel in the line. So definitely drain that tank. Don't use an angle grinder. Don't mess around with this because one spark could cause a whole lot of trouble. All right, so this sender I ordered for an 87 Firebird. As long as you get one from a fuel-injected third gen, it should pretty much be the same thing. A link to this one is going to be down in the description. So a couple of things I need to do to this. For one, I'm going to be cutting these lines straight off here, like when I removed the old one. And I do need to switch around the functions of these. So I kind of have these labeled. V is the vent, E is evap, R is the old return, which is a 5/16, and the old feed, which was a 3/8. So I'm going to keep the same exact feed. I'm just going to cut it off here, flare it for an AN hose, and then jump that up to the 1/2-inch line that's going to be on the body. The old return is not going to be used. I'm going to just cap that off. And then the evap I'm going to completely remove, and I'm going to install this fuel cell bulkhead because these factory wires, they're not going to be nearly enough, not even close, to run my new pump, which is a Walbro 400. This is the same pump that I pulled out of my Camaro when I upgraded to the 450. So this is going to work great for this, and hell, it's even going to support some boost if I do decide to go that route in the near future. Now, for our new return, I'm going to be using the old vent line that had a little one-way valve. So I picked up this 3/8 line here. I'm just going to clamp this onto here. That's going to be our new return. And then for the actual venting of the tank, I'm just going to run a vented gas cap, and that's going to do the same job as this line with that little valve would have did. One last thing, if you do pick this sender up, I highly recommend double checking this connector here, because the way they're made, just the design of the pins, mine, this pin wasn't perfectly centered. It was bent off to the side, and you can see how long and flimsy they are. When you go to put this in, you may feel like it's engaged and this may clip on, but if they're not perfectly centered, it's going to go off to the side, and eventually the vibration is going to leave you stranded. Don't ask how I know that, so definitely double check this connector. All right, our fuel sender is done, ready to go in the tank, and I'm actually really happy with the way this freaking thing came out. So I did run into a couple of issues. I thought I'd have this done in a couple of hours. I'm on day 2, just finally perfecting it. So the first problem I had was the bulkhead for the wiring. I drilled out the existing evap line, being I wasn't gonna be using it. The problem was it was off center though, so I couldn't just drill it straight down, otherwise the nut wouldn't be able to go on because of the slip. So I had to kind of drill it off center, and then I had to fill it with solder and file it down to get a flat surface. But in the end, I got it in there. I got my 10 gauge wiring soldered right off the pump through the bulkhead, through this nice Delphi connector. Other thing I kind of did, last minute change, the return, I initially had it clamped right up top here, and it ended about here because this hose wasn't long enough. I just took a piece of pipe I had cut from the top, and I just soldered an extension because I wanted to get this down far enough to make sure it doesn't aerate the fuel or anything, because where it was ending before, the gauge would be at half, and I figured that's not really good place. If it was at a quarter, I probably would have left it, but I just wanted to, rather be safe than sorry. And then the final thing I did was plug the old return. So the old return line actually supports the pump. It's just 5/16 it comes down, and then the pump is clamped to it. So what I did was take a alignment plug or peg that I had from the Tahoe, from the upper control arms that locates like the slider, and I got that in there, soldered it up so that's not gonna siphon fuel out the back. And yeah, this thing it's ready to go in. Now, one thing I do want to mention, this is a 400 liter per hour pump. This is gonna be plenty for this thing, for what we're doing for it right now, like NA. But when it comes to boost, we're not gonna get very far with this, and it is gonna run out of steam faster than on LS setup. So you gotta know, being this direct injected, it requires around 70-75 PSI base pressure for the lift pump. So this is the lift pump. This takes the fuel from the tank to the direct injection pump, and then that, forces it into the engine. But being it has to run at a higher PSI with this, it's not gonna get us as far as it would in an LS setup. Being an LS fuel pump only has to run at 58. But for the time being, it should do what I need it to do. And when it comes time to really push the power into this thing, like I said, I think I want to get like 1,000 out of it. I'm gonna have to probably look into maybe like a 4th gen fuel tank, because I don't want to go to like a loud external pump or anything like that. And the problem with these cars, the fuel tank, the hole is so small, you can only fit so much pump side by side before it doesn't go in the tank anymore. I think you can fit like 2 255s, 2 340s, and then it's not gonna fit. We would never get another 450, 400 in here, which is exactly what I wanna do. So down the road, eventually we'll look into like a 4th gen tank option, because I do believe you can fit 2 of these pumps in the top of that tank. But right now, let's drop this thing in, get the wiring hooked up. Then we're gonna go up front, we're gonna pull the engine out, because I need to run the hard lines from the tank along the frame rail to the firewall. All right, so our fuel system is just about finished. Last two things I need to do are make our final two braided hoses. So I need to make a connection from the regulator to our hard line coming off the pump, as well as the regulator to the fuel rail. Now I have no fuel rail, I have no engine in here, so I'm gonna wait on that hose. I gotta make sure it's the right length and everything. So I'm gonna run it once the motor is back in the car. But I am gonna make this final hose to connect our regulator to our feed, and I'm gonna show you guys kind of up close exactly how I do that. Now, as for everything else, I got our feed line ran, got the return ran directly next to it. Kind of went a little fancy with this one. I ended up using these little threaded inserts that I kind of popped into the body to secure the fuel lines. And then for the return, I just zip tied that to the main feed, being that was anchored to the body. And these guys are plenty secure. You do got to make sure you clear the steering shaft over here. So I made sure I was far enough back so that doesn't rub. And we should have plenty of room to run our rear brake line, because that's the only other line I really need to run from here to the back of the car. Now, as a little added precaution, I did add this fiberglass insulation over the lines from this point to about like behind the rear seat area, just to make sure the heat from the exhaust isn't gonna warm up our fuel and cause any potential issues. But let's go over to the bench. I'm gonna show you guys how to make that final hose, and we'll be ready to wrap this thing up. All right, so here's the line I've been using. Now this is PTFE, so it's plastic. I've used the rubber in the past and it works just as good, but the plastic is supposed to be better for long term. The fuel isn't going to eat it away. Some people may say that you get fumes if you use the rubber hoses, like the fumes can apparently penetrate the rubber. I never had any issues like that when I did use them on my Camaro, but for the sake of this build, we are going with the more expensive, more higher quality PTFE. Now, the way this works, you pretty much have a regular hose end like you would on, like a regular rubber braided hose, and you have this little collar. So what happens is the bottom of the fitting, which is essentially the nut, is going to slide onto the line first. Then the little collar is going to get stuffed in there until it's fully seated to that top lip. Once that's in there, we are just going to simply insert the hose end. That's going to go through there, and then we're going to slide the nut up and tighten it. And what that's going to do, once this is tightened, it's going to clamp this collar down on that plastic line, and then you're going to have a secure hose end. So first thing we want to do is cut a clean piece off of this hose. And to do that, you're going to want to wrap the hose in tape. Now, I use electrical tape for pretty much all the hoses I just made, but I definitely recommend painter's tape. Painter's tape always seems to work better for me. I just didn't have any, so I took some with me this morning to show you guys how to do this. So let's just give it a couple wraps. That should be fine. And we're gonna make our cut straight down the tape. Now what that's gonna do is keep all the little metal braids from just splaying out how these were. And that's gonna allow us to get our fitting on. So next thing we wanna do, well, what I like to do before pulling the tape off is to slide the nut on itself. Because you see, this has to go on here. So if all of those little bits of metal are sticking out, it's gonna give you a hell of a time trying to get that on there. So with that in, let's go ahead and remove our tape. And you can see exactly how nice that actually came out. It's not all like frayed or anything. All right, so the next thing we wanna do is get our collar in here. Just gonna tap that down a little bit. Want to make sure it bottoms out, and that one did. You can see it's flush with the top lip, all the way slid at the top of this collar. So now our final step, what I like to do is just use a little lube on this. I just got some silicone spray. And I am putting a 90 on this, so just slap a little silicone spray in there, a little on the fitting. We're gonna put this right into here. It's bottomed out. Slide our nut forward. Now we just got to finish tightening that down. We'll just tighten this until the fitting bottoms out. You'll know because it physically can't move anymore. It bottoms out against the nut. I think I could go a hair more with that. Yeah, that's it. All right, the Trans Am as a fuel system. We are making progress in the right direction. Now, next month, April, I am gonna have another episode out on this thing. I can't give you an exact date, but rest assured it's gonna be sometime next month, and it's going to be on the front suspension. So we're gonna do a full rebuild, get the wheels back on this thing, get the brakes hooked up, master in, run the line to the back. So all that stuff's gonna be taken care of in the next episode. But before that, I do have a Tahoe video coming out because she's running great. Just no problems at all. It's broken again. The transmission blew up. So yeah, that video is going to be coming out in probably about a week or so. Now, as always, I'm gonna link everything I use down in the description. So my fuel pressure regulator, I'm gonna try to get all the little fittings that I use and put them down there as well. The hard lines, the 1/2 inch, the 3/8, as well as that LS1 fuel filter. So once again, if you're just doing a plain Jane LS swap NA, definitely go with that filter. It's got your filter taken care of because it's a filter. You got your regulator built into there, and you don't have to run a separate return all the way up to the engine. It's cheapest, easiest way to do it. So I highly recommend that if you are doing just a basic non-boosted LS swap. But once again, before I close this video out, I just want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring it. And if you are in the market to create a new website or domain, what better way to do it than by using Squarespace's powerful and beautiful platform? With Squarespace's all-in-one, easy-to-use platform, you're going to be able to connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated members-only content. This is going to allow you to manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights all in one easy-to-use platform. You'll also have the option to create a community on your Squarespace website with a fully integrated commenting system. Of course, this is going to have support for threaded comments, replies, and likes. On top of that, you'll also be able to use their powerful blogging tools to categorize, share, and schedule your posts as well. On top of all that, if you're looking to extend Squarespace's already powerful e-commerce capabilities, you could do that with Squarespace extensions. These are new third-party tools that can help you manage inventory, promote products, streamline bookkeeping, plus much, much more. To top it all off, you can also display posts from your social media profiles on your website. So you'll be able to automatically push content from your website to your social media profiles so your followers can share it as well. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Lsxmatt for 10% off your purchase of a website or domain. Once again, thank you Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and I'll see you in a few days.